There are missing child cases that break open quickly, where a lead surfaces within days, where the evidence falls into place, where investigators can draw a line from disappearance to resolution within a matter of weeks. And then there are cases like this one. This is the story of a 6-year-old boy named Danny Calloway, who vanished from the backyard of his family home in Millhaven, Kentucky, on the morning of April 20, 1993. He was wearing a yellow rain jacket 2 sizes too large. He was carrying a plastic dinosaur. He had asked his mother 3 times if he could go outside, and on the 3rd time she said yes. 15 minutes later, he was gone. What followed was not simply an investigation. It was 30 years of a family learning to live inside an unanswered question, of detectives who retired without a resolution, of a community that kept placing flowers at a fence long after the cameras went away, and of a man in Knoxville, Tennessee, who opened a genealogy app on his phone one evening in 2022 and felt the ground shift beneath him. This is not a story about the worst of what people do to one another. It is a story about endurance, about the particular kind of courage it takes to keep believing for 30 years that the truth is still out there, and about what happens when, against every probability, it turns out to be. Millhaven, Kentucky sits in the western corner of Calloway County, roughly 11,000 people arranged across a grid of residential streets, farmland, and the kind of commercial strip that exists in every small American town. A diner, a hardware store, 2 gas stations, a post office that also sells lottery tickets, and a single-screen movie theater that plays films 2 weeks after they open anywhere else. It is the sort of place where people leave their cars unlocked in their own driveways, where neighbors know one another's routines well enough to notice when something is different. Violent crime exists here, as it does everywhere, but it is rare enough to be genuinely startling when it occurs. The landscape around town is gentle. Rolling hills, creek beds, the kind of dense tree cover that turns a brilliant orange every October and draws people from neighboring counties just to drive through. By late April 1993, spring has fully arrived. The dogwood trees along the side streets have begun to bloom. The air carries that particular sweetness that only exists in the narrow weeks between the last frost and the first serious heat of summer. Mornings are cool enough for a jacket. Afternoons are warm enough to make children restless. It is a Tuesday. April 20th. The elementary school on Birch Street will not let its students out for another 3 hours. On Sycamore Lane, a few blocks from the center of town, the morning is moving at its own unhurried pace. Carol Calloway has made scrambled eggs and toast. The kitchen window faces the backyard, a fenced lot with a garden bed along the south edge and a wooden gate that latches from the inside. It is the kind of backyard that feels safe precisely because it is enclosed. Private. At 8:47 in the morning, Carol watches her 6-year-old son pull on his yellow rain jacket, grab a plastic triceratops from the porch railing, and head around the corner of the house toward the back. 15 minutes later, she goes to check on him. The yard is empty. Danny Calloway would turn 7 in September, a milestone he had already announced to every adult willing to listen. He was a compact, energetic boy with red-brown hair that his mother could never quite get to lie flat, and a gap between his front teeth that gave his smile a slightly impish quality. He was, by any account from those who knew him, a thoroughly ordinary 6-year-old in the best possible sense of that word. Enthusiastic, curious, prone to elaborate explanations about topics that interested him. Chief among those topics were dinosaurs. Danny had developed a genuine command of prehistoric taxonomy, rare for a child his age. He could identify species by silhouette and recite Latin names with the casual fluency of someone who had simply absorbed the information through prolonged enthusiasm. First grade had not diminished this. It had, if anything, given him an audience. The yellow rain jacket, a gift from his maternal grandmother, sent up from Lexington the previous Christmas, was a size too large and swamped his small frame in a way that was objectively impractical. Danny wore it every chance he got, regardless of weather. His mother, Carol, had learned to pick her battles. The jacket appeared in every family photograph from that winter and spring. It appeared on the flyer that would be printed overnight and distributed across Calloway County the following morning. Carol Calloway, 34 at the time of her son's disappearance, worked part-time at a florist on Main Street. She was described by friends and neighbors as steady, warm, and quietly capable, the kind of person who organized things without drawing attention to herself. Ray Calloway, 37, worked for the county road department and had for 12 years. He was not a man who expressed himself easily under pressure, which made the months that followed both harder and, in certain ways, more legible to those around him. Melissa, Danny's older sister, was 14. She was at an age when younger siblings were more inconvenience than companion, and the guilt she carried about that for years afterward is something she has spoken about publicly only once. The family's morning routine on April 20th was unremarkable in every detail. Ray had left for work before 6. Melissa had eaten in silence and slipped out the side door to meet a friend. Carol washed the dishes. Danny asked 3 times if he could go outside. On the 3rd time, she said yes, reminded him not to leave the yard, and watched him disappear around the corner of the house. She would spend the rest of her life replaying those 15 minutes. At approximately 9:02 in the morning, Carol went to check on Danny through the kitchen window. The yard was empty. She told herself, as any parent would, that he had simply gone somewhere inconvenient, behind the shed, into the ditch along the far edge of the property. She went outside, calling his name in the mild, slightly exasperated tone of a mother who expects to find her child where he is not supposed to be. "Danny." No answer. The fence gate was closed, latched from the inside. She stood at the edge of the yard and looked in all directions. The ditch was empty. The neighboring yards, visible through gaps in the hedgerow, showed no movement. The street on the other side of the fence was quiet. The plastic triceratops was sitting in the grass near the garden bed, alone. Carol went back inside. She called Ray's work number, then the neighbor across the street. Then she walked the full block in both directions, calling Danny's name at full volume. Then she went back inside and dialed 911. The call was logged at 9:23 a.m. She told the dispatcher her 6-year-old son was missing from their fenced backyard. She had not heard him leave. She had not heard anything unusual. He had been wearing a bright yellow rain jacket. In the space of 36 minutes, a Tuesday morning in a quiet Kentucky town had become something else entirely. The first officer on scene was Deputy Willis Greer, who arrived at the Calloway home at 9:31 a.m. He searched the yard methodically, the garden shed, the space beneath the back porch, the gap in the hedgerow a small child might squeeze through. He walked to the fence perimeter. The gate was latched from the inside, as Carol had said. The fence itself was wooden and weathered, with gaps wide enough for a 6-year-old to see through and, with effort, to climb. Greer noted a scuff mark on the lower rail, in the soft morning earth just below it, consistent with a small sneaker. Within 40 minutes, 3 more deputies were on scene. A door-to-door canvass began immediately. Every house on Sycamore Lane and the 3 adjacent streets was contacted before noon. 2 witness statements, gathered that afternoon, would remain in the case file for the next 30 years. The first came from Harriet Odom, 71, who lived directly behind the Calloway property. She had been sitting on her back stoop that morning, drinking coffee, watching her bird feeder. She saw a yellow jacket through the fence boards, moving, and then not moving. She assumed it was the Calloway boy, whom she knew by sight. Then, perhaps 5 minutes later, she heard a car door close. Not on her street, on the alley access road that ran behind the back row of properties. She assumed it was someone from the utility company. She did not look up. The second statement came from Gerald Pruitt, who had been walking his dog along that same alley road at roughly the same time. He remembered a dark-colored station wagon, maroon or possibly deep brown, parked partway onto the grass at the edge of the road, engine running, a figure in the driver's seat, though he had not looked closely. His dog had pulled towards something in the weeds. When he glanced back a moment later, the car was gone. He had not written down a plate number. He had not thought much of it at all until the sheriff's deputies knocked on his door that afternoon. A maroon station wagon, an alley road behind a fenced yard, a gate latched from the inside, a scuff mark in the mud. A canine unit was deployed. The dog, a Belgian Malinois named Rook, was given Danny's pillow to scent. He followed a trail from the back fence, through the gap in the lower rail, across the alley access road, to the precise spot where Gerald Pruitt had seen the station wagon parked. There, the trail went cold, asphalt, and tire oil. The scent disappeared at the road's edge. The trail did not continue. Ray Calloway arrived home from work to find his street blocked by police vehicles and his wife standing in the front yard surrounded by neighbors. He stopped his truck in the middle of the road and got out without turning off the engine. By 6 o'clock that evening, more than 200 volunteers had gathered at a staging area in the First Baptist Church parking lot 2 blocks away. They formed grid lines and walked the surrounding fields, the creek bed behind the water treatment facility, the network of trails through the patch of dense woodland at the edge of town that locals called the Brambles. State police aircraft circled overhead. By nightfall, the search had covered dozens of square miles and found nothing. No jacket, no sneaker, no sign of a small boy. A multi-agency task force formed within the first week. The FBI's Louisville field office sent 2 agents. The Kentucky State Police assigned a detective liaison. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Arlington, Virginia was notified. And within 48 hours, Danny's information was in their national database. Age-progressed images would follow at regular intervals over the years. Detective Sergeant Louise Hartley, with 12 years of investigative experience, took charge of the case file on the second day. She built the timeline in 15-minute increments. She identified a window of approximately 40 minutes during which Danny could have left the yard or been taken from it. She noted that the access alley was not visible from the kitchen window. A car parked at the alley's edge would have been invisible to Carol. The task force pursued 2 primary theories, N19. The first was a stranger abduction, opportunistic, by someone who had spotted the boy through the fence boards or from the alley road. The second was a targeted abduction, involving someone who knew the family's routine and the layout of the property well enough to have planned for this specific morning. Every person connected to the Calloways was interviewed. Ray and Carol submitted to polygraphs voluntarily. Both passed. Their histories showed nothing that suggested motive or involvement. Forensic teams processed the yard and the fence. They recovered fibers from the gap in the lower rail that did not match any clothing belonging to Danny or any family member. A partial shoe impression was lifted from the mud at the alley's edge, consistent with an adult male shoe, size 10 to 11. Both items were logged, photographed, and stored. Without a suspect to compare them against, they were leads without destinations. The maroon station wagon became the investigation's most pursued and most frustrating thread. Detectives ran DMV records for every registered dark-colored station wagon in Calloway County and the 6 surrounding counties, hundreds of vehicles, each one tracked, each owner interviewed. None produced a viable suspect. A tip line was established. When Danny's story aired on the NBC affiliate in Louisville and then on CNN on the 4th day, the volume of calls required rotating operator shifts. Within the first month, more than 3,000 tips had been logged. The vast majority were unusable, but some were deliberately cruel. In the 3rd week of May, a man called the tip line and provided detailed, specific information about Danny that appeared to go beyond anything published. The task force spent 4 days pursuing the lead before a behavioral analyst noted inconsistencies. Under pressure, the caller admitted he had fabricated everything from news coverage. He had wanted the reward money. He was charged with filing a false police report. It would not be the last such call. By the end of summer, Sergeant Hartley's task force had logged more than 4,000 tips, interviewed over 300 individuals, and pursued dozens of what she privately called near leads, things that looked substantial from a distance and dissolved on approach. The fiber evidence was sent to the FBI lab in Quantico. Results returned 6 weeks later, consistent with a common type of work gloves sold at hardware stores across the country. Useful in theory, useless without a source. In October, search parties became monthly. In November, they became occasional. The command center moved from the church parking lot to a room inside the sheriff's department. The active investigation had not ended, but it had contracted into something quieter and harder to sustain. The first anniversary of Danny's disappearance passed without resolution. Hartley held a press conference. The photograph was shown again. The tip line number was repeated on air. 17 calls came in over the following week. None were actionable. Carol and Ray stood together in the backyard at dusk on April 20, 1994, and lit a candle. They did not speak for a long time. The second anniversary was smaller, the third smaller still. Carol, who had worked part-time at the florist on Main Street, did not return to that job. She could not explain why, except that she could not leave the house for longer than she absolutely had to. She sat by the kitchen window that faced the backyard. She did not move Danny's dinosaurs from the shelf in his room. She washed the spare yellow jacket, the one he had not been wearing when he disappeared, and hung it on the hook by the back door. She would dust it weekly. She would never take it down. Ray threw himself into work and into a quiet volunteer organization he and Carol founded in 1995, assisting other families of missing children in Calloway County and the surrounding region. They drove to case hearings, they sat with other parents in waiting rooms, they helped organize searches when new cases arose. Sergeant Hartley retired from the department in 1999. Before she did, she spent 3 weeks reviewing every item in the Calloway file from the beginning. She updated her notes, flagged 2 items for her successor, and placed a detailed memo at the front of the binder. In it, she wrote what she had come to believe after 6 years of looking. Danny Calloway had been taken by someone methodical, someone who had watched the family, someone who knew the rhythm of that yard on a weekday morning well enough to have planned for it. She did not know who, but she was certain that when the answer finally came, it would connect to something already in those boxes. Her successor, Detective Carl Moberly, read the memo 3 times. In 1997, Carol gave an interview to a documentary filmmaker studying missing child cases in rural America. She sat at the kitchen table and talked for 4 hours. She covered the morning, the eggs, the yellow jacket, the triceratops in the grass. She did not cry during the interview. The filmmaker later wrote in her own notes that Carol Calloway had the kind of stillness that comes after grief has burned through everything softer. What remained was a clarity she had not chosen. In 2001, DNA technology had advanced sufficiently for the Kentucky State Police Crime Lab to retest the fiber evidence from the fence rail with more sophisticated methods. The results confirmed the earlier analysis. Work glove fibers, nothing further. In 2003, highway construction near a town 30 miles from Millhaven unearthed skeletal remains in a shallow drainage depression. Small remains. The call came to Carol at 7 in the morning. She sat down on the floor when she heard it, the phone still at her ear. Ray found her there when he came downstairs. They drove to Bowling Green together and waited in a hospital family room for 11 hours while forensic examiners worked. Dental comparison confirmed the remains were not Danny's. They belonged to a different missing child from a neighboring county, a girl who had vanished in 1988. It was closure for that family. For the Calloways, it was a door that swung open and then swung back again. By the 10th anniversary, Danny would have been 16. Carol bought a birthday cake every September regardless. The number of candles had stopped corresponding to his age years before. The ritual was not morbid to her. It was maintenance, a way of insisting on his continued reality in a world that had largely moved on. Danny's case entered the internet era slowly. Ray taught himself basic HTML from library books and built a website in the late 1990s. By the mid-2000s, the case appeared on several dedicated missing persons platforms. Age-progressed images created by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children showed a boy aging into a teenager, then into a young man. By 2010, the progression depicted a 23-year-old with Ray's bone structure and Carol's eyes, the ghost of a gap-toothed grin still somehow present in the architecture of the face. In 2019, a TikTok video briefly went viral claiming to show an age-progressed photo of Danny next to a photograph of a man spotted at a Tennessee rest stop. The images bore minimal resemblance. The video accumulated 3 million views before the man in the Tennessee photograph came forward and identified himself as a retired schoolteacher from Clarksville who had never been to Millhaven. The sheriff's department received 200 calls in 4 days. Carol did not look at the video. She had long since stopped following the online discussions. They opened doors she could not afford to leave open. On the 29th anniversary, in April 2022, a reporter from a Louisville television station drove to Millhaven for a segment. Carol sat on the front porch and spoke for 40 minutes. She was clear-eyed and composed. She said what she had always said, that she did not know what had happened, that she did not know if Danny was alive, that she chose to behave as though he was, because the alternative was not something she was prepared to accept. Not yet. Possibly not ever. The segment aired on a Tuesday evening. Approximately 70,000 people watched it. Among them, in a small apartment in Knoxville, Tennessee, was a 35-year-old man named Aaron Cole. Aaron Cole grew up in rural eastern Tennessee, the only child of Walter and Patricia Cole, who ran a landscaping business out of Granger County. He had been told from early childhood that he was adopted. His parents had never hidden it. They had wanted a child. They were given the opportunity, and they had been grateful every day since. Aaron had accepted this fully. He loved his parents, he had a good life, a job as an electrician, a small apartment, a dog named Howard, a group of friends he had known since high school. He had auburn hair, a gap between his front teeth, a dimple on the left side of his face that appeared when he smiled and that he had inherited, so far as he knew, from no one. In January 2022, 3 months before the anniversary segment, Aaron had submitted a consumer DNA test out of general curiosity about his ancestry. He received results in March, no close family matches, mostly British and Scots, Irish descent. He dismissed the results and moved on. But in April, after watching the segment, he went back to the genealogy platform. He had left the family matching function active. He had not checked it since receiving his ethnicity estimate. He had a new match. It had appeared in late March, after Rosie, Melissa's teenage daughter, had encouraged her grandparents to submit their own test. The Calloways had not yet examined the results closely. The match on Aaron's account read, Carol Ann Calloway, age 63, location, Millhaven, Kentucky, estimated relationship, parent-child, shared DNA 3,487 centimorgans. He stared at that number for a long time. 3,487 centimorgans is not a second cousin. It is not a half-sibling. There is only one biological relationship that produces a shared DNA measurement in that range, a parent and a child. He scrolled further. Ray Allen Calloway appeared at a similar shared measurement. A second account. Melissa Ann Turnbull, née Calloway. The missing child website appeared at the top of the results. He read every word. The date of disappearance, April 20, 1993. The age, 6. The last known clothing, a yellow rain jacket. He scrolled to the age-progressed images. The one labeled age 35 looked back at him from the screen. He closed the laptop. He sat in the dark for a while. Then he opened it again. My. He had been told he was adopted as an infant. The Calloway's son had disappeared at age 6. There was a discrepancy. But adoption paperwork could be altered, ages could be falsified. A child placed through an illegal private adoption could be described however the intermediary chose. He began, carefully, to look for the attorney whose name appeared on his documents. He found a death notice from 2008. He found a disciplinary record from the Tennessee State Bar from 1999, improper handling of client funds, inadequate record-keeping in adoption proceedings, license suspended, retirement shortly after reinstatement. He called his mother. Patricia listened quietly as her son told her what he had found. Then she said that she and Walter had always wondered if they had asked enough questions, that they had been so frightened of losing him, that they had paid the attorney what he asked and accepted the child who was brought to them with a gratitude so enormous it had silenced the doubts they should have voiced. On the 8th day after finding the match, Aaron called the Calloway County Sheriff's Department and asked for the detective assigned to the Danny Calloway cold case. He was transferred 3 times before reaching Detective Blythe Cannon, who had held the cold case designation for 18 months. He explained what he had found. Cannon listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked several questions in a methodical order that told him she was writing things down. She told him she would need to verify everything and proceed carefully. She asked him not to contact the Calloways directly until she had spoken to them first. DNA verification through law enforcement channels moved faster than Aaron had expected. Within 2 weeks, a forensic lab compared Aaron Cole's profile against the reference sample taken from Danny Calloway's bedroom in 1993 and entered into CODIS over 20 years before. The probability of biological parentage between Carol Calloway and Aaron Cole, 99.1999%. Detective Cannon drove to Sycamore Lane on a Thursday evening in early May 2023. She rang the doorbell at 6:15 p.m., Carol Calloway answered. Carol later said she knew something was different the moment she saw Cannon's face. Not the urgency of bad news, something else, something she did not have a word for. They sat at the kitchen table. Ray came in from the back room. Cannon placed a folder on the table but did not open it. She said, "We believe we have located your son." The silence that followed was described by Cannon, in her own words filed afterward, as the longest she had ever sat through. Carol did not move. Ray put one hand flat on the table, as if confirming that the surface was solid. Cannon told them what she knew. A man named Aaron Cole, 35 years old, Knoxville, Tennessee, DNA confirmation, the adoption paperwork, the attorney, the biological match that left no statistical room for doubt. Carol said one word, alive. Cannon said yes. Ray put his face in his hands. His shoulders moved. He did not make a sound. Carol reached across the table and placed her hand on Cannon's wrist. She said, "Does he know?" Cannon said yes. He had been the one to find her. The video call happened 4 days later, arranged with assistance from a victim advocate at the Kentucky Attorney General's office. Aaron was in his apartment in Knoxville. Carol and Ray were at the kitchen table in Millhaven, with Melissa joining by tablet from Nashville. Her daughter Rosie was beside her. When Aaron Cole's face appeared on screen, broad-shouldered, auburn-haired, a slight gap between his front teeth, Carol pressed her lips together for a moment to steady herself. He said hello in a voice that was quiet and careful and a little uncertain. Carol said hello back. No one spoke for a moment. Then Ray said, his voice rough, "We've been looking for you for a long time." Aaron said, I know you have. I'm sorry it took so long." With a confirmed victim identification and an illegal adoption established, the dormant investigation ignited. The FBI's Louisville field office reopened the federal case file. The deceased attorney's files, recovered from a storage facility by his former office assistant who had kept them out of professional habit, revealed a pattern. Between 1989 and 1996, 11 private adoptions with minimal paperwork, all involving cash payments ranging from $25,000 to $50,000, none involving traceable biological parent documentation. Children's ages in the filings varied. In several cases, toddlers or young children were recorded as younger than they actually were, a falsification straightforwardly accomplished in a pre-digital records era. Cross-referencing those 11 adoptions against regional missing child cases produced 3 potential matches. Investigators moved carefully. The intermediary, the woman who had brought Aaron to the Cole family, was identified through aged DMV photographs and composite descriptions from multiple witnesses as Norma Delaney, who had died of natural causes in 2014. Her financial records from the relevant period showed cash deposits inconsistent with any legitimate employment. The man believed to have carried out the abduction itself was traced through the fiber evidence, the partial shoe impression, and financial records connecting Delaney to a network of 2 individuals who had operated together through the 1980s and 1990s. One had died in an Alabama prison in 2011. The second, 71 years old, was found living in a retirement community in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. His arrest in November 2023 was quiet. He did not resist. He was charged with kidnapping, conspiracy, and child trafficking. Aaron Cole drove to Millhaven in the summer of 2023. Carol came out the front door before he reached the porch. She walked down the 3 steps and stopped at the bottom. She had prepared for this moment. She had practiced what she would say. She did not hold herself together. She crossed the 5 feet of concrete between them and put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood there for a long time in the July heat while Ray watched from the doorway with one hand on the frame. After a while, Melissa's car turned onto Sycamore Lane and pulled to the curb. Rosie got out first. She walked up to Aaron with the directness only children possess and held out her hand. She said, "I'm Rosie. I'm your niece." He shook her hand very seriously. He said, "I know. I've heard a lot about you." Aaron Cole had no memory of Millhaven, no memory of the backyard, the fence, or the morning in April 1993. He had been 6 years old. His memories from that age existed only as impressions, the smell of something, the color of a room, nothing that had ever resolved into a coherent picture of a place he might have been taken from. He did not remember the triceratops in the grass, but he had always liked dinosaurs. He stood in the doorway of Danny's room for a long time that first afternoon. He looked at the dinosaurs on the shelf, the spaceship sheets on the bed, the yellow jacket on the hook by the back door, visible from where he stood. He did not remember any of it, but something in the configuration of the room, the particular angle of the afternoon light, the smell of the house, registered in a place below language, below memory, below anything he could have explained. Carol came and stood beside him. She put her hand on his arm. She said, "You don't have to remember, you just have to be here." He said, "I know. The process of building a relationship took time, as it was always going to." There were video calls and visits, questions asked gently and answered carefully. The slow accumulation of shared context between people who were biologically family and experientially strangers. Aaron's wife, Laura, and their 2 young children participated when Aaron felt ready. Carol and Ray met their grandchildren through a screen first and then in person, and each of those moments carried a weight that no one tried to make smaller than it was. Walter and Patricia Cole, the parents who had raised Aaron with love and without knowledge of the crime that had made his adoption possible, cooperated fully with investigators from the moment Aaron called them. They were devastated by what they learned. They were not treated as perpetrators. They were victims of the same network. The legal and ethical complexity of their situation was handled with a recognition that assigning blame where none existed served no one. He added to his life the family he had not known existed, and navigated the duality of that, loving the people who raised him, coming to know the people he came from, with a thoughtfulness that those around him have described as remarkable, and that he himself has attributed to simply having no other option. The Calloways did not remove anything from Danny's room. What they did was open the door more often. The case of Danny Calloway and the network that was exposed by its resolution carried implications that extended well beyond Millhaven, Kentucky. The investigation revealed that between 1989 and 1996, at least 11 children had been moved through a single illegal private adoption operation spanning 4 states. Several of the adoptive families, like the Coles, had no knowledge that the children they were raising had been taken. The exposure of that network, made possible only by Aaron Cole's DNA match 30 years after the fact, demonstrated with particular clarity what law enforcement agencies and child safety advocates had long argued, that cold cases are not closed cases, and that evidence gathered in one era can produce results in another that could not have been anticipated at the time of collection. The fiber samples from Danny's fence rail, the partial shoe impression from the alley mud, the scent trail that ended at the road's edge. None of these had been sufficient to make an arrest in 1993, but they had been preserved. They had been maintained in the case file through 6 changes of assigned detective, through the dismantling of the Task Force Command Center, through 30 years of institutional transitions and budgetary constraints. When the DNA match provided the identity of a victim, those dormant pieces of physical evidence became part of a corroborating record that supported a trafficking conviction. The case also contributed to ongoing conversations about consumer DNA databases and their role in cold case resolution. Aaron Cole had submitted a standard commercial DNA test out of casual curiosity about his ancestry. That act, entirely unconnected to any investigation, taken by a private citizen with no particular expectation of consequence, produced the lead that 30 years of active law enforcement work had not. The implications of this for how agencies approach long-term missing child cases continue to evolve. Several states have since expanded their protocols for maintaining DNA reference profiles in missing child cases indefinitely, rather than archiving them after a fixed period. For the families of the other children identified through the network, some still living, some not, the resolution brought varying degrees of closure. The word is imprecise, as it always is in these cases. What it brought was accuracy, the replacement of an unanswered question with an answered one. That is not the same thing as peace, but it is not nothing either. In Millhaven, the case is discussed differently now than it was for the 30 years it was open. It appears on the County Historical Society's documentation of significant local events. It is referenced in training materials used by the Sheriff's Department. The anniversary vigils at the Calloway fence continue, but they are no longer purely acts of mourning. They are also something else, a recognition that the community's sustained attention to a case that might easily have been forgotten was not wasted effort, even when it seemed for decades to be yielding nothing. On October 20th, 22, the 31st anniversary, Aaron Cole stood in the Value Mart parking lot. He stood at the base of the Calloway fence on Sycamore Lane with his family around him. He touched the wooden gate. He did not say very much. Terrell placed flowers at the base of the fence post, as she had done every year. The gesture was the same as it had always been. What it meant was not. The red toy truck that Carol Calloway had kept on the kitchen windowsill for 30 years, dusted weekly, moved whenever anything else moved, never once put away, sat on the kitchen table that afternoon. She set it in front of Aaron when they came inside. He picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. He did not say anything. He did not need to. There is a particular cruelty to not knowing. It differs from grief in the way that an open wound differs from a scar. Grief heals, imperfectly, slowly, but it moves. Not knowing cannot move. It is held in suspension, sustained by the unanswered question at its center, unable to resolve in either direction. Carol and Ray Calloway lived with that suspension for 30 years. They made choices, every day, about how to inhabit a life that had been torn open and could not be closed. They chose to search. They chose to stay. They chose to keep the jacket on the hook and the truck on the windowsill, and the room exactly as it had been on the morning of April 20th, 1993. What the resolution of this case ultimately reveals is not that the system worked perfectly. It did not. A child was taken in broad daylight from a fenced backyard in a town of 11,000 people and was not found for 30 years. Systems failed, patterns were missed, evidence sat in boxes without a key to unlock it. What the resolution reveals instead is the cumulative power of persistence, of evidence preserved across decades, of a community that kept placing flowers at a fence, of a detective who wrote a memo before she retired and trusted that her successor would read it, of a family that kept a website active with photographs of a boy who would have been 6, then 7, then 16, then 35. In case someone, somewhere, was looking. And of a man in Knoxville who opened a genealogy app on his phone one evening in April and did not close the laptop when the numbers became frightening. The story of Danny Calloway and Aaron Cole is not, in the end, a story about what was lost. It is a story about what was found and what it cost to find it and what it means to keep believing, for 30 years, without certainty, without guarantee, that the truth is still there. It was. If you or someone you know needs support related to missing children, contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE-LOST or visit missingkids.org. Their resources, including family support services and DNA-based family reunification programs, are available at no cost.